Okay, so let's take a look how to work with the mouse inside cocos2d Python. And I have here just a simple sample scene, just with a UFO sprite loaded, or an UFO image loaded. And if you want to work with mouse inside Cocos, you will need to use the underlying pyglet. And for that I'm going to go to Google and type pyglet, and we are using the version 1.3.2, so just open this documentation. And as I said earlier, cocos2d Python is built on pyglet. So if you want to use mouse, you can scroll down here in the documentation, and here is the working with the keyboard, and here is the working with the mouse. And it also has working with other input devices using joysticks and so on, but now I'm interested in this one, so working with the mouse. And cocos2d for mouse uses the pyglet, or I mean, when you want to use in cocos2d the mouse functionality, you will need to use the underlying pyglet mouse event. So as you see, here are some predefined mouse events. So the mouse motion, the on mouse press, on mouse release, on mouse drag, and also on mouse enter when the mouse enters the screen or the window, on mouse leave, and also on mouse scroll when you want to use the scroll wheel. So let's go back, and I'm just going to import from pyglet, pyglet.window, import the mouse. And the most important thing here is a layer. If you want this layer to detect mouse clicks, you need to set this layer to an event handler. So is event handler equals true. So if you go to the layers document, I mean not the documentation but the source code, so go to declaration, the layer inherits from a cocos node, and in the first line is event handler is set by default to false. So here is a comment: if true, the event handlers of this layer will be registered. And yes, we want to the event handlers to be registered on these layers, so that's why I'm setting here in the first line is event handler is underscore event underscore handler to true. Okay, now I'm just don't going to type this out, rather I'm going to copy from the pyglet's documentation the on the mouse press first. So on mouse press, and don't forget we are inside a class, so as a first argument we need to give it the self, and then the xy and the bottom and the modifiers. So now let's just print out the X and Y position when I click with the mouse here in the console. As you see here, for the pyglet window or the cocos2d window, the 0, 0 coordinate starts from the lower left corner. So if I click here, and it increases to the right and up, so the 1280 and 720 coordinate will be in the upper right corner. Okay, so now I just want to create a simple method. So when I click on the sprite, it will detect that I clicked on the sprite. So the first thing I want to check which mouse button was pressed. For now it detects all three of my buttons, the left, the middle and the right as well, so I'm going to show you. Now I'm going to click with the left, with the middle and also with the right. So it's detecting all three of my mouse buttons. So in the mouse press event I want to check only for the left mouse button. So, and you can do this by checking if button and, which is the binary and, mouse.left, and then print out the X and the Y. So if button is pressed and with the binary and, the mouse left button is pressed. So now when I click with the right mouse button or with the middle mouse button, nothing happens, only when I click the left mouse button. So here in this if statement I'm going to make a longer if statement which will detect if the click, I mean if the mouse button press was inside or on the sprite. So I'm going to create an if X is less than the self.sprite.x plus the self.sprite.width and x is greater than the self.sprite.x. So this is checking for the X, so for the horizontal position. And let's continue for the vertical or for the Y. So and Y is less than the self.sprite.y plus the self.sprite.width. I mean not width but height. Self.sprite.height. So self.sprite.y plus the self.sprite.height, and the last check is y is greater than self.sprite.y. So let's print out if this whole expression is true. Then print out UFO head was clicked. So let me try this out. So when I click in the black area nothing happens, and when I click on the UFO head it says UFO head was clicked. UFO head was clicked. So if the mouse X position is less than the sprite X plus the sprite's width, and the mouse X position is greater than the sprite's X position, and the mouse Y position is less than the sprite Y position plus the sprite's height, and the mouse Y position is bigger than the sprite's Y position. So we need to use AND because all of these expressions must to evaluate to true. Okay. So now that we have a way to actually detect if the mouse click was on the sprite or not, I'm just going to move this whole if statement to its own function, and I'm going to name it this mouse underscore on underscore sprite, mouse on sprite, and it will take two arguments, the X and the Y position of the mouse. And I'm going to cut this out and put it here into this on mouse on sprite method, and if this is true, then return true, and if this expression evaluates to false, I am going to return false. And here in the on mouse press 7, when the left mouse button is pressed, I am just going to ask if mouse self dot mouse on sprite and give it the X and the Y, then print out this message UFO head was clicked. So let me try this out. So when I click in the black area, nothing happens, and when I click on the sprite, UFO head was clicked. And in order to work, you need to set, when you load the UFO head sprite or any other sprite, you need to set the anchor point to 0, 0, which means if I go to the images, or here is the UFO head, by default the anchor point is in the middle of the sprite, so the origin point. And if you set here the anchor point to 0, 0, it will move the anchor or the origin to the lower left corner of the sprite, so to this location. So it's necessary to set the anchor point in order, if you want to copy this, just pause the video and just copy this whole if statement. And the next thing I'm going to just implement is the on mouse motion. And I'm just going to copy this, here it is in the Pyglet documentation, copy and paste it here. On mouse motion, don't forget we are in the class, so as a first argument we need to give it the self. And let me see. First I'm going to check if self.mouse on sprite and give it the X and the Y. So that's why I moved this if statement to its own method, so that I can reuse it in the on mouse motion as well. So if the self.mouse on sprite is true, then I'm going to change the cursor. So when the mouse so when I hovering over the sprite, I just want to change the cursor to a hand instead of this arrow, which is default. you know what, I'm just going to copy from the official documentation, and yes, here it is how to change the cursor. So copy these two lines and paste it here, and instead of the window that gets system mouse cursor window is in the pyglet, we need to add this the director.window. So director.window that get system mouse cursor, and here also director.window.cursor help. I'm going to change this to cursor hand, and here also director.window.set mouse cursor to the cursor. So let me check it. So now when I'm hovering over the UFO head sprite, the mouse cursor will change to a hand. Of course it not changes back because we need to add an else. And I'm just going to copy these two lines and paste it here and change this back to cursor default. So when I'm hovering over, the arrow changes to a hand, and when I leave the sprite, it changes back to an arrow. Also, you can, on the mouse motion, you can also print out the X and the Y to the console. So you will see that this mouse motion, every time when I move the mouse, it detects the mouse's position on our screen, on our window. Okay, let's remove this print statement. So if you go back to the Pyglet's working with mouse documentation, we covered the on mouse motion and the on mouse press. Here is the on mouse release, so what should happen when the mouse is released, the mouse button is released. Also the on mouse drag, and here are the mouse left, mouse middle, mouse right. I just used here the if button and mouse left in the mouse press event. And here you have the on mouse enter. So what should happen when the mouse enters the window or when the mouse leaves the window. And also for the scroll wheel, so on mouse scroll. And you can set the mouse visibility to false with set mouse visible false. And here are the cursors. So we are using this arrow, and when the mouse is hovering over the sprite, it changes to the cursor hand. Here, cursor hand. So you have also the crosshair and the cursor help and all of these cursors. Here is then the Windows and for the Mac OS X. You can also load custom mouse cursors with image pyglet.image.load, and the cursor with this method pyglet.window.image mouse cursor, setting it to image, and window.set mouse cursor to cursor if you want to have a custom mouse cursor. And I just recommend you to read through this documentation on Pyglet mouse event handling, and I'm just quickly going to show you one more method, which is the on mouse drag. So here def on mouse drag, don't forget to give it the self, because we are in a class. And in the on mouse drag, I'm going to set the self.sprite.position equal to the x and y for now. So let's test it. So when I click on the sprite and I start to drag, I can now drag the sprite with my mouse, although it is not perfect yet, because I can click here, let's say, and the sprite will jump to the mouse position. So when I click and I start to move with the mouse, so I start dragging, it will jump, the sprite will jump to the mouse position. So no matter where I click, it just jumps to the mouse position. So to prevent this behavior, here I am also going to ask if the self that mouse and sprite is true, so x and y, and then change the sprite's position. So let me try this out. So I'm clicking here, nothing happens. So when I click on the sprite, now I cannot drag the sprite as before. So I need to add one more thing to this self.sprite.position, and for the x, I'm going to subtract from the x the self.sprite.width, and is divided by 2, and also from the y I'm going to subtract the self.sprite.height, and also divided by 2. So this is the integer division. So and now let's try it. So, and yes, now it moves with the mouse cursor. And if I click outside, so in the black area, not in the sprite, it won't, the sprite won't jump to the mouse cursor's position. It only detects when the cursor was clicked on the sprite. So, of course, you can also add here if the left mouse button is pressed on, only then do these things. So that's all I wanted to show you. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.